We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time. Well, this panel will certainly be an opportunity for us to see if we can make things a little bit better. So welcome to everyone for this event today with President Goldfajn, Ilan Goldfajn, who took over the IDBs, elected president at the end of last year. And I'm really excited about this because the region itself is going through a very difficult time, as I'm sure Ilan will tell us. And if you look at the prospects for the region, they don't look very good at the moment. In most countries, you see growth numbers going down, plus social pressures, all rising, political difficulties. And at the same time, the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, of which the IDB is part, are also going through a process of change and adaptation, trying to see how they need to change the way they work to take on board many of the new challenges, the global challenges, whether it's dealing with climate or pandemics or other cross-border challenges, alongside the work that they've traditionally done. And I'm sure that is also going to play out as the IDB thinks about its role. So today we have a great opportunity to first hear from President Goldfajn on sort of how he sees the agenda going forward for the IDB and the region and the countries that it serves. Then we have a wonderful panel of three CGD colleagues who are going to be, many of whom it turns out are also alumni of the IDB in some states. The IDB has a long history and engagement with us, both at the institutional and personal level. So Amanda Glassman, Liliana Rojas-Suarez, and Nancy Lee will then sit down with Ilan and have a conversation. So that's the plan for the next hour. And with that, Ilan, thank you so much for making the time to come to CGD. And your session is kicking off for us a week and a half of events around the spring meetings, which will bring to CGD leaders of development banks, but also representatives of countries as they look at the agenda ahead, including the agenda for the reform of the multilateral financial institutions. So with that, Ilan, I welcome you and thank you for being here. Please.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Masood. Pleasure to be with this panel. Amanda, Nancy, Liliana. As Masood mentioned, they're all IDB family. I'm learning as every day I find more people from the family. I'll do a genealogical tree around Washington. I'll find a lot of, because the IDB is the place where people say, well, I was there, and they still feel it's part of them. We're just talking about President Iglesias, 90-something. He still feels that this is his legacy, his child, and I'm proud to be part of this legacy. I wanted to talk today in this initial remarks before we have the Q&A, the interesting part, just to tell you a little bit about my vision for the IDB. As Masood mentioned, there is a challenge of the region. There are challenges for the MDBs. So let me tell you where I want to go with the IDB. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the priorities. And finally, how do we get there, to get these visions and priorities. So let me start with what I believe should be an Inter-American Development Bank. It needs to be the most important institution in Latin America and the Caribbean. But what does it mean? It means first that there needs to be somebody leading the region, a vision. Where do you think is your comparative advantage? Where do you think you fit in the world? Have a vision for the region, aggregate the leaders of the region, and then insert this vision in the global challenges, in the global public goods, in the global issues you have. But somebody needs to be there and be the leader of the region. And I think an international organization has to have this role. That's number one. Number two, you have to fulfill a role that goes beyond lending, the amount of dollars you lend, even beyond the technical assistance you give. You need to be the knowledge bank, which means that there is a lot of experiences you have in different countries over time. You learn from their successes, you learn from their failures. And given this bank of knowledge, you become the most trusted partner of any government of the region that feels that he needs to do a tax reform, or he needs to invest in infrastructure in a specific sustainable place. And there you go and you say, well, this we have already experienced. So a vision, where do you go? You can lead, trusted partner for the long term, being a knowledge bank. And last but not least, and we have learned about it recently, you need to be a bank where the staff is proud to work there. And to be proud, you need to have a leadership that people believe, that are transparent, accountable, and ethical, and where you believe that the bank is making a difference. So that's I will say, a more vision of the bank. And how do you get there? Well, first, you need to do what we tell countries to do, which is prioritize. There are not enough resources available. We know there are not enough resources available in the public sector, in governments, but not enough in the international public sector. We know it. And when you do the right calculation, you also know that the amount of financing, for these sustainable goals and others is not enough, even when you calculate all the private sector. So we need to prioritize. So I started IDB saying, well, let me try to tell you a little bit about where are the areas we would like to focus. And it's always a dangerous thing, because somebody feels, well, you forgot about me. What about that? Why you are not prioritizing that? But I started saying, well, when there's too many priorities, it means that you have none. So I started saying, well, the three main areas that I think we should be prioritizing. First, core IDB social. And that means poverty, social protection, and there has been an improvement in the last few decades in the Latin American Caribbean, but from the pandemic we gave up a few years. There's a lot of work to do. Inequality, not a lot of improvement. So a lot of things has to do with that, and there are now quite a bit of dimensions in inequality. One is the income, but there's also gender inequality, diversity issues. So inequality in a more general sense is something that we need to prioritize, because also societies are demanding that increasingly. And you can see it on the streets, we can see it on the elections. they are demanding more social. And in the social, of course, they all want public services, health, education, and recently they want food security, which is more conjectural but very important. So that's the first line, which is social, core IDB. You need to work on that. Second, and of course, major global public good, climate. So climate change, and here, of course, there is the Paris alignment, and we talk about mitigation, but we also need to talk about adaptation. Climate change has arrived in the region, and it's not a theoretical possibility. It's not something that will happen. It's already there. I was just in Panama, and at the IDB, we had quite a bit of, in the last several years, with reactions from the Caribbean members, from the Central America, where they get quite a bit of natural disasters from hurricanes, and there are islands, and you can see it there. So that's where you need to have not only adaptation, but you also have to react to the natural events in an agile way. But in the Panama, I've already found out that it's not only those most vulnerable, but we had just fires in Chile, a huge drought in Argentina. You had floods in Brazil and other places. So everybody is looking and say, well, this is a major issue. So climate is already a reality in the region, and clearly one of our priorities. Last but not least, there is a need to increase investment in infrastructure, both physical, because the investment physical has been low, but also digital. So all the digitalization and all of this has to be part, because this is the future, this is where innovation is coming, it needs to be there. But we need to focus on regional projects. Why regional projects? Because governments usually do their own projects. They were elected, that's their mandate, those are the citizens. They can always think about externalities and spillovers and joint efforts, and then think about how that's affected. But an international organization, the mandate is the region. We are not really organized by region, but the mandate is for the development of Latin America and the Caribbean. So the comparative advantage for thinking about regional projects is in international organizations. I can give you several ones. Let me give you one, which is biodiversity, Amazon. Those are all the Amazon countries. When I look around, every one of them has its own initiative. The IDB has its initiative, Colombia has its government, Brazil has its Amazon fund, everybody's doing it. But if we want to make a difference, we need to be able to scale. And in order to be able to scale, you need to bunch. You need to be together. So in this case, everybody can do whatever they want, but let's coordinate. Let's use all the resources in the same plan strategically. So that's a regional project. It's harder because you need political will. You need a coordination device. You need somebody to be able to give the resources and the knowledge. Maybe the IDB can do that. So you need political will, but you need somebody like the IDB to do that. So that's a regional project. That's a comparative advantage of a multilateral organization. So social, climate, investment, focusing on regional projects. How are you going to get there? I already talked. We need to scale. You prioritize in order to be able to scale. You bunch efforts to scale. There's no competition between multilateral development banks. We actually have to work together because the only way we can actually make a difference is if we can scale things. So that's why you need different areas. Scale also means that you need to bring the capital from the private sector. So all the multilaterals together, the governments together, also public and private. It looks like it's a very difficult coordination effort, and it is, but that's the only way you can actually make a difference in my view. And finally, scale is one part of it, but the other part is efficiency. And I think Amanda was joking that the last time she heard development effectiveness was, I don't know how many years. To be honest, the IDB is always talking about development effectiveness, but I think there needs to be a command from the top that in addition to scaling things, we need to do it in an efficient and way where each dollar you spend, it's actually making a difference. And it's easier to say than to do, because from the decision to actually implementing, there's so many steps, and it's quite hard to actually get the maximum out of each dollar that you have. So that was my vision, priorities, how these main elements, and now we're ready to talk and to exchange views with our experts here. Yeah.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. While people are getting seated, I want to remind you that this is a live broadcast, that if you have comments and questions, you can add them below our YouTube feed, you can tweet at us at CGDEV, or you can email us at events@cgdev.org. If you're in the room, you'll simply raise your hand. But before we turn to the audience, we've assembled a stellar panel of both Center for Global Development experts as well as IDB alumna, as Masood told us. And we'll start off with you, Nancy, on the issue of the big picture of MDB reform. So what question do you have for Ilan on that?
Thanks so much. And it really is a pleasure and an honor to have this conversation at such a timely moment, because not just the Inter-American Development Bank, but really all major multilateral development banks are thinking about their evolution. So I wanted to start with your priorities, and take the conversation a step further. So you mentioned your three priorities: social, climate, and infrastructure. And what I wanted to ask you about is your priorities in terms of instruments, the kinds of support that the region wants and that the IDB is offering. So this is a region that has many middle-income countries. They have market access in many cases. They're making their own decisions, as you said, about what they want to borrow for, what they are issuing debt to finance, including both social and climate objectives. So in that context, is the bank evolving its tools so that it is not necessarily doing the same kinds of operations that it did in the past? In other words, do your borrowing countries want to borrow from the bank still, or do they want, or do they also want the bank to help them improve the terms on which they borrow from markets?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm learning all the instruments that IDB has. They have not been developed in the last 3 months I'm there. But yes, I'm impressed how new instruments are arising, and they are born from necessity. And you mentioned middle income, and those are the middle income needs. Of course, we have vulnerable and fragile countries, but you're right. Most of them are middle income, and they have their necessities. Some of them can access markets, and I will say they can access it in more general terms, but they still want a type of instrument that can be innovative, and they can use the IDB. So I can give you examples. Think about Uruguay. They have access to markets. It's one of the higher ratings, lower cost, but still they develop with the IDB a sustainable bond, which is a bond that reduces your borrowing cost, if you reach a sustainable indicator. So that gives incentives for the country to reach a specific sustainable indicator. It gives transparency for the investors, where they're investing and why are they doing it. It gives a purpose for that. And you bring the IDB with this second priority, if you want, the climate, together with the expert, with the knowledge, and therefore you get this type of instrument in a country which is a middle income, have access to market. So that's one. But there are other type of instruments. For example, you have we have two necessities, if you want. One is deal with large debts, and the other one is that conservation nature. So born from necessity, you have for debt to nature swaps, where all the savings you use for a purpose, and that's an institution like the IB helps develop. So that's another thing that you develop by necessity, and it's there. And then you have the green bonds, which are more general, or you have, for example, the IDB Invest issuing a bond, a gender bond, where the proceeds of this issuance finance small and medium enterprises where the leaders are women. So you see that they are not normal bond like plain vanilla. They are more sophisticated. They come from the necessity, but they also come from the priorities. And I think this is where the IDBs need to be focusing on doing that specific role and knowledge.
Great. I mean, we could talk a lot about loans based on results,
Yes.
or what's the role of policy-based loans.
Yes.
We'll come back to that. But let me turn to you now, Liliana, picking up on this issue of maybe the situation with respect to access to capital markets is changing in the region. Liliana, what was your question?
Yeah, I like Ilan to place Latin America now in the global context, which is changing dramatically, right, recently. The spring meetings are coming up, and in the last meetings in October, the IMF and the World Bank, especially the IMF, kind of warned about, there is a slowdown in economic growth, there's a fear of global recession, and inflation is there and is persistent. Now in the spring meetings, they are going to continue with that, and they are going to add another concern, which is financial stability, right? Especially with everything that's been happening with banks in the US and Europe. So in that context, this access to international capital markets that countries have the privilege of having right now may not be as great as before, right? The spreads are already starting to increase, and investors become risk averse. And so my question to you is, how ready is the IDB to play a counter-cyclical role? Not only in terms of funds, which is of course essential, but also in terms of processes and procedures. So how ready are you for the eventualities that might be coming in the near future?
So the question is, what is the role of the IDB as a counter-cyclical institution? And Liliana is right that we are entering, we all have already entered actually, a more tightening financial situation. And you mentioned some of the casualties we had, which is more uncertainty. So that all leads to more difficult access to markets and maybe the need for more resources. So the question is, what is the role of an IDB? I think there is a counter-cyclical role. I don't think it's the same role as the IMF or other institutions, or the IMF, where you're dealing with balance of payment issues and mostly budget issues where you need to finance a specific period. But there are counter-cyclical roles. One of them is that we need to help governments have their own fiscal stabilizer. And there's a very important role of institutions and generate their fiscal rules. And so there is quite a bit of advice and technical assistance to countries how to have their own system of countercyclical. So and you will say, well, that's actually interesting because you answer me by telling how countries should do it and not you. But still, there are issues where the IDB is countercyclical. For example, when you have, for example, we have the fund which gives money when you have a catastrophe, when you have a natural event, and then you can borrow money from that, the CCF, and the pandemic was used quite a bit. So we'll say, well, there was a role, there was this window, it was used, you gave more money given because you had this ex ante. It's also true that there is some leeway on programming. Even though you finance medium-term and long-term loans, you can bunch it a little bit. I mean, you can bring it all in the same period. You're still worried about the medium and long-term and development, but you can bunch a little bit of the investment. So there is some flexibility of doing it, and the IDB has been doing it in the past, where you have an issue and you can play a little bit with the disbursements.
Thanks.
Yeah, Nancy did some interesting work looking at how well the different MDBs responded during COVID-19, both with reprogramming, but also with new lending. And maybe we can come back to that. But I think you found that it's not exactly fit for purpose, although it's true that they have these coping mechanisms. Now it's my turn. I guess the question is, you've talked about poverty reduction and social equity as priorities, but there are two big challenges when you think about reforms in that area. You know, if we think about pensions, if we think about education subsidies, if we think about health systems, and that is the fiscal space to expand spending in these areas. And second, the sort of institutional quality around some of these sectors that sometimes require very major policy reforms. What would you see as the IDB's role in that space?
I think the role is essential in the sense that I believe that the region has a triple challenge today. More social demands, and I mentioned poverty, inequality. Societies are impatient for better public services, health, transport, education, sometimes connectivity. And you feel, as I mentioned, you feel in the region that this is there, either because you can look at last week, there's always a country with some protests and some changes, or changes happening through elections. But there is a clear sense that the demands for social protection or social goods is on the rise. It's more impatience is there. But your question is fundamental because countries have not more resources to deal with it. They actually have less resources. They're more constrained. Some of them have higher debts, either coming from the pandemic. Just to give you a number, average debt in the region is 60%, which is high relative to the rest. It went up to 70%. We actually had some consolidation afterwards, so 65%, which was actually good news because usually it goes up and it stays. It went up and it went down to the middle, but still we got 5% on average higher debts, and fiscal resources were already short, and you have even less now. So you may say, well, why don't we just create the resources? But that means growth, productivity. And that has been the long-term challenge of the region. We have not. Average growth is 2%. If you do per capita, it's 1% maximum. So demand for more resources scarce, and you were not able to grow the resources. So that's the triple challenge. And now we have other challenges, which are climate, that I just mentioned. So this is all together. So what do you do? That's the question. And first, we have to realize that we cannot do everything. So what is exactly you going to do? What are you going to target? Which is always difficult because every item or every priority is always have its own reason and purpose, and it's very hard to say, well, we were going to prioritize something else. But we need to do it because that's the only way you actually can use these scarce resources to do that. And that's the only way that you can actually scale, because it will be easier to scale when you have one purpose, where everybody comes and you have instruments that are more innovative and you can do it. So first, prioritize. Second, we need to work on several items of the efficiency that we talk. One of them is capacity in the countries, because we can work a lot of the efficiency at the IDB. Are you agile enough? Are you have everybody aligned? Are we actually allocating the resources in the right place? But once you allocate, is the capacity in the countries to actually, because the projects there in the country are not in Washington. They are there. So are we efficient there? So that's the second. Now, there are some issues on more in the countries. So you can be more efficient. And we have a research that shows that with the right reforms, you can actually get 4% more spending with reasonable reforms. You don't need to do a major issue, just small changes. Second, you need to be able to use your tax system sometimes to help you with inequality, with the social issues, and you can do it. And I don't think our tax system today is helping us a lot in this social part. So on the spending side, prioritize, be more efficient. On the tax side, more progressivity. There's a lot of space for doing that. And finally, in terms of productivity, a lot of space to do it. With the innovation, I come from financial background, so the financial inclusion, there's a lot of things to do in the financial inclusion. So I think the agenda is large, luckily, because there are a lot of things to do.
Yeah. Well, I think you're raising an issue in an implicit way, which is around the political economy of reforms and some things that we can do. Liliana, you had another probing question on that topic.
Yeah, just want to follow up on what you just said. Small reforms can produce a lot of change. Now, the need for reform in Latin America is overdiagnosed. Everybody knows the list of reforms that need to be done. And the prescription has been on the table for over a decade. And the region is not moving. Those reforms are not taking place. And they are needed, especially to meet your priorities. I mean, those three priorities, you cannot do it on your own, as you said. They need the region, right? Mm-hmm. You need the region. So, and adding what Amanda just said, in the context of the current political polarization that we're living right now, there's no appetite for that reform that you need so much. So in that regard, what can the IDB do this time that is different from what's been doing so much time to actually move the needle on reforms?
Well, we need to be able to look at the problems and be able to provide, I will say, first a new narrative, for example. We tend to look at the region as a region that has problems, and please, all these countries, please come, help us, finance us. We need to do a lot of stuff. We are part of the problem. Please help us. But when you look at it in another way, I think there is a way where you can look at the region as part of the solution. What does it mean? That the region has some comparative advantage in some places where if you actually invest in that, where you actually put your effort that, you can reach a lot. Let me give you just two examples. I talk about food insecurity. Well, we are having a conjunctural issue of food insecurity, but there's a more structural food insecurity for some time. The region trades 40% of the food globally. And that's not a coincidence because you have the land, you have the water, you have a comparative advantage to do that. With the right incentives and with the right financing, our research department shows that you can actually multiply by 8, both in the large, but also in the small and medium farms and agriculture. You can work with transport, with distributions, where you can deal with the food insecurity in the region, but leading with this productivity in those places, you can actually produce and can feed 10 billion people. Mm-hmm. So the region could be not only solving its own issues on the food, but also be part of the solution. You can insert yourself saying, well, we are the place we can actually help. That's one issue. Think about the second that we talk about, climate. There's a huge public challenge, public good. And when you look at the region already has 30% on renewable energy, which is around double the average, already there. There are some places like the Central America where it's 80%. And we have some countries like Panama that's 100% naturally carbon negative. So you have very good examples there where if you put a little bit more effort and you concentrate more, you can get there. And I think there is a comparative advantage of generating this clean energy, this renewable in the region. You can produce much more than other regions, and you can actually export this clean energy if you want globally. And when you look at, for example, the minerals, they are the right minerals there. Think about electric cars, lithium. Mm-hmm. 2/3 of the global production of lithium is in Latin America. So when you look at the future and you think about where are we going, what are we going to do, where are we going to focus, you can focus in the right places. Instead of focusing, we are part of the problem, what are we going to do? So I think there's another way to look at it and try to generate the momentum and the productivity we need.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the good news, I guess, is that a lot of the leaders of the region have articulated progress on the social sectors as one of their key goals. Yes. So it's really a discussion about strategies. So the question is maybe some more technical advice from the IDB would be helpful in that regard. Speaking of doing things differently, Nancy was part of the G20 Capital Adequacy Framework work. Do you want to ask a bit about what the IDB is doing in that space?
I certainly would.
Excellent. It's not scripted at all, as you can see. Yes.
So you've mentioned scale and you mentioned efficiency in another context. And it's obvious, given the scale of the challenges across both these domestic and the global public good challenges, shareholders are going to have to make some decisions about capital, where to put it, and as well as concessional resources. But I think more than at other times, there's another big issue on the table, which is, can institutions use their existing capital more efficiently and have greater volumes of lending with their existing capital while preserving their very high AAA ratings. And that is the conclusion of the capital adequacy panel, which is, yes, indeed, the capital could be used much more efficiently, and the panel recommended a whole series of steps. We've heard a lot about the World Bank's response to that report, and they've already indicated that they can increase their annual lending by about 20%, taking some of the steps in the report, not all of the steps. So I'm sure shareholders are very interested in how the bank is progressing on that issue. Where do you see potential for more efficiency? And do you actually see significant potential for increased lending on the basis of existing capital?
I think the capital adequacy framework is fundamental because in a world where there's so many needs for resources and demand for capitalization, which is basically public money, you need to be able to use in the best way possible each dollar of capital. and we need to go to the limit on this efficiency. And there are several recommendations, and I think there's some improvements in the last years, but there's more to do going forward. The IDB has been less vocal about what it has done, and I think we should talk more about it, but also talk more about what is going forward. So I will say that you have, since 2015, even before, there was a lot of efforts where I think you got into an additional lending of several billions. Part of it was reduced by the fact that anytime you have lower ratings of our members, it means that the risk-based capital reduces. So given that there was some trend in the last, 7 years of lower ratings because of the pandemic and the crisis and all of that, so there was an average low rating, and that's eats a little bit into your capital. But even despite that, you increase your lending capacity. So today we have a lending capacity which is around 4 billion more than you have, and that's based on those efficiencies. What type of efficiencies? There's several of them. I'll just give you one example: diversification, which is one of the recommendations. The regional banks are, by design, concentrated in your region. So that means that your risk is concentrated by design, because but it's not by design that you have to keep this risk in your balance sheet. So can you actually diversify this risk? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. You can do it with other types of donors. There was, for example, an exchange arrangement with the African Development Bank where you swap, and that increased the lending capacity. There was also an arrangement with one of the donors, Sweden, that provided a guarantee for a specific risk, and that allowed, given that you have a guarantee for a risk, it frees capital, and you can provide much more resources to the other. So those things are happening, and what I just gave the examples are not this year example. It's 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So you need to be more vocal on what made these billions available have increased, but that does not mean that you have reached, in my view, the optimal capacity, because there's much more that you can do with the guarantees, with the donors' resources that can tell you, with diversifying the risk. So there's quite a bit to do, and I think this is, at some point, it will be not only an effort of a specific framework, but it will be a frequent and permanent effort to do.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, I guess one question for you, how far does balance sheet optimization take you before you might need something more? I know IDB Invest is on the road to a capital increase, but what about IDB sovereign side, given the very ambitious goals with respect to poverty reduction?
So, as you say, we just came out of the Panama's annual meeting, which is the IDB yearly meeting, and we got the mandate for talking about the future plans of both the IDB Invest, that is the private arm of the IDB, and also the IDB Lab, which is our financing side that finances the startups and the very beginning of the enterprises. So both of them got a mandate for growth plans, which include plans for capitalization. I entered on not only my campaign, but also when we were talking about the vision, and I didn't mention it so much, but a little bit, that I believe there's quite a bit to do in terms of effectiveness of the resources we provide. There are several indicators on how effective you are. They are all debatable because there's no single measure. But I have been vocal about saying, well, independent of the indicators, there's a lot of room to improve. And in order to improve that, you need a lot of steps in terms of effectiveness or the impact. And I have mentioned some of them. One of them is that we tend to focus too much on the amount of dollars we lend to a country and maybe not enough on the ultimate goal of these resources. And if there was a stable relationship between the amount of dollars and the impact, I will not care about it because it will be a good proxy for that. But I do believe that the relationship between the amount of resources, dollars you give, and the impact you have has broken. And sometimes you provide a lot of resources, a lot of dollars with little impact, and sometimes you don't have a lot of dollars with high impact. So unfortunately, we cannot rely fully on our normal unit of account, which is the dollars amounts, and we will need to look more carefully about targeting the ultimate goal. So that's the first, and it looks easy, but that's a major cultural change because that's the way we communicate, that's the way we reward, that's the way we measure our performance, that's the way we talk. And unfortunately, that doesn't give us today an accurate measure. So that's a very important change. And to do that change, a lot of things have to happen in the middle. One, as I mentioned, incentives. Economies, we always have incentives. So we have to provide incentives to whoever actually generate the impact and not whoever is giving more loans or is able to get it. And that's important and difficult because the impact is not easy to measure. Sometimes it's not easy to attribute to a specific project. And sometimes things happen, you have a commodity boom, and everything looks perfect. And it's not because of your effort, it's because it just happened. So it's very difficult to do that. But unfortunately, we don't have the option to just stay and say, well, let's pretend it's all well. We need to be more effective in that. So I'm saying it because when we talk about capitalization, we need first to make sure that this project is on the way. And then we can talk about future capitalization.
Excellent. Well, that's the first time you've heard a counterfactual, the need to demonstrate attribution in the counterfactual from an MDB head. So kudos, hard work ahead. So we have 10 minutes for you from the audience to ask questions. We have someone running around with Charlie. Will come. Please say who you are, where you work, and your question.
Thank you so much. Helga Flores Trejo with Bayer, the pharmaceutical and agricultural company. And I was very happy to hear also the importance of food security and, of course, a tremendous contribution that the Americas, if you look at the whole continent, already provides, but can provide. I was wondering, what would be new ways to work from your side with the private sector? Because since I've been at Bayer, we have experienced how innovative ways of collaborating, for example, for forest protection with the LEAF Coalition, where governments, companies, and others, we join and mobilize 1.5 billion for forest protection. On food security, we're doing something similar for smallholders. Any thoughts on how we can collaborate better with private sector?
Okay, thank you. Let's collect a couple questions. There in the back. Go ahead. We can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Ludovic Arnaud from University of Oxford. You mentioned social policy, environmental policy, infrastructure. Is there some thinking at the IDB about industrial policy and how this could be combined with the other factors? Looking, for example, at lithium, if there could be some investments to move into battery production and moving into higher value-added production.
Okay, and a last question. I see Goldo, Scott. Come on. These guys here want to ask a question. Now? Okay, Thomas, front row on development effectiveness.
Not quite. I'm Thomas Ginn. I'm a research fellow here. And I'm wondering where you see the IDB's role in migration, specifically on host countries, forced displaced migrants, obviously Venezuelans, but that's become much more talk at the World Bank, and I'm curious where you see the IDB's role here.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. So that's 3. Do you want to add your last quick questions, and then Ilan can wrap it all up?
It's just out of your remarks, just very quick. Are you concerned about, how we've been talking so much about commodity dependence from Latin America, and now that lithium and other, minerals are coming up are you concerned about that that's going to incentivize that dependence that makes the region very volatile to the change in prices?
Nancy, any last?
All right, just very quickly, I can't resist the opportunity to ask a question on IDB Invest. You mentioned cultural change in institutions to reward outcomes. What is the cultural change and the other changes that need to be made in IDB Invest to put the focus on mobilization of private finance as opposed to their own commitments?
Okay, so a long list. Ilan, back to you.
Easy question.
Yeah, so there were
Private sector.
2 questions, exactly. Thank you, that's a good moderator.
I'm like a professional here.
Yeah. So private sector. There were 2 questions. One is on what are we doing? You're talking about in agriculture and other places, but also IDB Invest in general. What is the approach here that can work? There are several dimensions. One of them is the fact that you need to be able to enter a country or a region with enough partners that you enter with a scale, which we call it mobilization of capital, how are you going to do it? And that's the buzzword, but the question is how? And there are several ways to, I think you can try to do it. First, I will call it reputation, which means that IDB enters, and that gives IDB Invest, in this case, enters, and it gives a signal that this is a place where you can enter. There are always costs of due diligence, and is this the right place to do or not? But when you enter together with the IDB, you assume that some of this knowledge that it's hard to find, somehow you are there. In the same way that you leverage on the AAA rating of the IDB for cost of borrowing is similar in terms of the reputation. Do you leverage in terms of the knowledge that you provide, and if there's some asymmetry or cost of reaching, you can bunch of people entered with you, and that's happening already in the IDB Invest, because when they invest, there is always some private partners entered together, and increasingly you are seeing that. That's one aspect. The other aspect of mobilization is that you need to think very carefully about, they call it de-risking. That's the buzzword, you de-risk. Coming from where I come, I don't like the word de-risk, because it looks like you disappear with some of the risks. In a very short run, the only way to disappear with the risk is doing reforms, long way, and then ratings go down, and then you. But in the short run, you don't de-risk, you distribute risks in a different way, and sometimes it's smarter for the public sector to assume some of these risks so that the private sector feels comfortable entering, and maybe they will enter in multiple ways, and that's the way you can mobilize, because you are substituting risks in such a way you provide the guarantees, or maybe you are the junior debt, or there are a lot of instruments that look like they're sophisticated, but at the end of the day, it's just let me assume part of this risk, come with us. If you can come 10 times, it's worth it. So that's another way of doing it, which is redistributing risks, and you can come. So one of them is reputation, and you bring. Second is distributing risk, and you can come. And finally is, from the other dimension, is financing the private sector. One is mobilizing, but the other one is the resources you provide to the private sector. And then we need to look at the impact, development impact, because we are not looking for high returns of just maximizing profits. We would like to look at the impact, and we would like to look at the impact in places where we believe there is some notion of public goods that you are delivering. So when you mention food security and investing in places where, so if you are doing part of that, that's exactly what the IDB should be doing, which is fostering that type of innovation in places where probably if you are not exactly there, you won't get this type of changes in the scale you want. So that's part of it. The second is places where it looks like there is, the market is not fulfilling its role. If you want to be sophisticated, we have incomplete markets. So one of them, for example, is small and medium enterprises. For some reason, we don't get enough financing for them, probably because it's too costly to look at due diligence for very small ones, so nobody looks at each one, so the risk is high, so nobody wants to lend, or when you lend, it's very high. So this is a place where I think IDB is doing a lot of work on trying to provide guarantees with the national development banks, with other private, so that they can distribute with the guarantees of the IDB. So that's another way where we can partner with the private sector. And finally, PPPs, it's an old word, public-private partnership, but there's a lot of knowledge at IDB from not only the successes, but also the failures of the past. And to be honest, knowledge from the failures has or more important than the successes. So I think we should not give on the PPPs. There have been successes, and I think we should continue that.
Great. Anything on industrial policy, forced migration?
Yes, so industrial policy, when I say when you want to prioritize, there will always get a question on what about industrial policy? You mentioned the street, and this is not there. So, but I did mention climate, and I'm going to find a common ground with you, which is lithium. And lithium is clearly a very important part of the priority of climate, because you need to generate the right energy use and the right minerals. So we need to be looking at the future, not only trying to avoid the use of carbon, but also finance, what I said, the future of clean energy, and lithium is clearly one of those. So I wouldn't say that we are prioritizing the industrial policy, but I will say that part of what is produced could be one of the three priorities I mentioned. Finally, on migration, I think the way we will frame it is that it is very important for the IDB to be able to provide routes for the community. So you will enter a country by providing either the skills that the migrants need to use in the communities, or you will provide the financing for small farmers so they can stay where they are. And the issue is not only staying where they are, but actually improving their lives. So I won't quarrel whether you'll be doing it for them to stay or to improve their lives. They are just the same. And we can work together to improve the lives of these people. And that's a way to also deal with the migration.
Thank you. I think we hope to see more regional labor mobility, including in the United States, as a major development intervention. But I also wanted to ask more questions, particularly about what about countries in crisis like Haiti and Venezuela. But we've run out of time. So we'll wait for your response as the weeks go ahead. And thank you so much for visiting CGD on your spring meetings week. And please join us for the rest of our program of events that you can find online. Thank you.
Thank you very much.